Okay, hello. I am Talia K. Brass, a candidate for a master's in anthropology at San Francisco State University. And today I am arguing that the psychological concept of self-determination can positively impact US children, families, and communities through its intentional application to education. I'm starting with the way that Native American tribes have defined and applied self-determination to education in their communities in recent decades. So my research begins with the problem that education in America is in crisis. I'll get back to the aspects of this problem in a few minutes, but I argue that self-determination will help solve these problems. If you see in the diagram here, there are three basic needs that must be present for individuals to feel motivated. These are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy is that people need to feel in control of their own life, behaviors, and goals. So this aspect is about choice. Competence is for people to gain control and mastery of their own lives and environment, and that they should be effective in these endeavors for their optimal wellness. The third aspect is relatedness, that people experience a sense of belonging and connection with other people. This psychological theory of self-determination derives from 1970s research on human motivation. Edward Deci and Richard Ryan solidified this theory, claiming that intrinsic motivation is what leads individuals toward better fulfilling their goals because the subject matter is interesting and the method is satisfying to that individual. Researchers primarily in the 21st century have begun to apply the theory of self-determination in both the social sciences and in education. Native American groups have been utilizing this model for more than just a few decades. Also, we'll get back to this point after a few more definitions. So intertextuality, which is part of the plan for local community involvement in education. Intertextuality is a 20th century scholarly concept that challenges the assumed relationship between words and the world. In regard to how groups and individuals describe their identities, the words they use at any given time are influenced by descriptions in the past. So this idea impacts the unique identity that a group would bring to their educational model. Thirdly, interdiscursivity is a concept that is embedded in both linguistic and philosophical realms. It plays two parts in my argument. First, I examine interdiscursive racialization, or as it says here on the slide, mixing identities. Secondly, I look at the role that teachers play between the public, government, and education. Educators mediate this racialization process in America. Next slide. Here we go. Okay. One of my literature sources that focuses on the education crisis in America is written by Matt Reichel. He conveys the heavy burden on teachers. He claims that recent teacher uprisings are rooted less in the need for better working conditions, but rather in the challenging discursive role that they play between families, communities, and the students on one hand, and policymakers and state and federal government on the other. He says how central elementary schools are in producing ideologies. His quote reads, "This is to say that prevailing value systems in any society are partially reflected and partially formed in this struggle over the soul of education. So, like it says here, I'm proposing a theoretical education model that privileges local community interests and epistemologies. My essay and project research examines the soul of education and the role it will play in the future. On the smallest level, consider the daily life of a child attending elementary school. Her day is filled with the activities, books, and topics that she learns at school. This is what she thinks about in her free time and space. And from here is where her creativity and worldview will form. So the subjects that she learns in school do matter. So for some background, Native American self-determination and education began earlier than in general US education. In 1975, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act was passed by Congress under President Richard Nixon. The law provided tribes with more autonomy to facilitate programs and services. The aim was to target the needs of local communities. Unfortunately, federal funding did not match the needs of Native American communities to fulfill this law. After the US Commission on Civil Rights reported on this deficiency, way later in 2003, myriad scholars and advocacy groups began to report on how Indigenous communities had planned to utilize self-determination. One of these scholars was Dr. Catherine Manuelito. She carried out ethnographic interviews in a Ramah Navajo community. She reports that the 7 different Navajo terms for self-determination encourage individuals to take responsibility for their own education. These Ramah Navajo people define self-determination as a road, as being proactive, as having a communal goal, a commitment to community, and importantly, as being forbidden from receiving personal credit. Manuelito developed these definitions into a metaphoric structure of a Navajo traditional home called a hogan. The 4 load-bearing pillars in her figure here on the right, there's the 4 load-bearing pillars represent the 4 processes toward self-determination. These are community-based planning, maintaining awareness of self, being proactive, and persevering. I'll not get into the history and tragic loss of Native American autonomy and education in this particular presentation. We know that it was severely suppressed despite documented success of tribally controlled schools in the early 19th century. But it is important to mention that for colonized or oppressed groups, community-based education offers an opportunity to operationalize self-determination. Intertextuality is the second concept that my argument employs to involve local communities in solving the US educational crisis. As I mentioned earlier, it's a concept that challenges the assumed relationship between words and the world. It dwells within this complicated linguistic interrelationship and can be applied to art, literature, and culture. The relationship between something in the world and its linguistic representation are constantly negotiated and renegotiated. As a result, past and present uses of language influence one another. In regard to how groups and individuals describe their identities, the words they use at any given time are influenced by descriptions in the past. An example of language revitalization for a California Indigenous group illustrates how past word use and present education programs can impact group identity. This is a photo of Loretta Kelsey, who is now the last living native speaker of LM Pomo. The LM Pomo is a federally recognized Native American tribe that currently resides on a reservation in Lake County, Northern California. Loretta Kelsey's efforts at language revitalization include documentation, developing a phrase book, teaching grammar at a local school, creating language camp curricula, and developing high school language classes. There was a 2007 article in the SF Gate entitled "The Only Living LM Pomo Speaker Teaches So She Won't Be the Last." And I will drop that link in the chat so you can read more about her and her story. It's important to take a minute to discuss the extreme endangerment of California native languages since the mid-19th century, following colonization by Spanish, Mexican, Russian, and American forces throughout the 16th to 19th centuries. The native population itself was reduced by over 90% during this time. The colonizers forced Native Americans to forget their indigenous languages under threat of death. As a result, intergenerational transmission of language was interrupted. Native fluent speakers of languages were practically non-existent by the late 20th century. Now in the 21st century, advocates and scholars are creating programs like those of Loretta Kelsey for the LM Pomo to revitalize endangered indigenous languages with the remaining native speakers at the center of the work. Noted here on the slide is native language as identity marker. It's a process coined by the linguist Jocelyn Allers. She identifies these new linguistic patterns that capture intertextual layering of past and present. One example is memorized speech, which is used for greetings and introductions. The example is here at the bottom. Heka te mai ushahe kemtsil. How questful people today? How are all of you today? I am not sure I said that right. So, but this is a greeting that is memorized and recited almost ritually at cultural gatherings and speeches. It's partially in LM Pomo, partially Spanish, and a lot of English. Most LM Pomo descendants speak English today. This is the contemporary identity. But this simple memorized speech pattern evokes many things. Pre-European colonization, sovereignty forever lost, enslavement in California missions, genocide, trauma, exploitation, life in reservations, renewed indigenous rights movements, and cultural revitalization. All of these aspects comprise the unique contemporary LM Pomo community. And this is the launching point for an education system that is self-determined. Now, let us be reminded of the argument here for a moment. It is to solve the education crisis in America. Small task. So far, we've discussed self-determination and the Ramah Navajo metaphoric Hogan, bringing autonomy, competence, and relatedness to the process. And we just spoke about intertextuality, how some California Native groups are using language revitalization to define new identities. The third aspect of local community education self-determination is called interdiscursive racialization. I found literature arguing that this process occurs through diasporic encounters. A diasporic encounter occurs when individuals with connected heritages have different understandings of a previous or imagined homeland. This diagram is from an article discussing Jewish diasporic experiences. There are groups of Jews who identify as Sephardic, represented by the red circle, and other Jewish groups who identify as Ashkenazic with roots in Eastern Europe and Asia. They're represented here in the green circle. There is a lot of mixing and migrating over centuries, and American Jews are not even represented in this diagram from Wax in 2012. But the point is that most Jewish people identify with Zion, Jerusalem, or a lost homeland. The same is certainly true for Africans in diaspora. The upcoming holiday of Kwanzaa celebrates African heritage in diaspora. These relationships sculpt the landscape of education in America. I am arguing that any subject can be taught within an ancestral framework. Traditional subjects like math, science, social studies, and literature are compatible with unique community value systems. Educational reform must begin with these elements, proceed with intentional self-determination, and only then will teachers, families, and students be motivated. So back to the initial problem where US education is in crisis. The inconsistency of resources received between minority and dominant cultural groups exacerbates inequity. State and federal education resources are distributed unevenly and inequitably. This is a chart from the US Commission on Civil Rights that was published in 2003 that I mentioned earlier, reporting on the lack of federal funding following the 1975 Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. As you can see, funding for the general US population goes up over the years, and funding for Indian-related programs does not match. This is an example of how dominant groups receive more resources than minority groups. Research shows that this simple structural disparity in education impacts life outcomes. Secondly, a standardized curricula. This quote is from the blog website of a retired American teacher. She is lamenting the repercussions of President George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind policy. The US has since moved away from this policy, but at the time, the federal government evaluated the quality of public schools through standardized student testing. That encouraged teachers to teach to the test. As this teacher's comment shows, important lessons are left out of the curriculum when policymakers at the highest levels decide what is important and what is superfluous. With local communities making choices about the curriculum in their children's classrooms, they are empowered to transmit local and self-determined interests and epistemologies. The third aspect to the education crisis in America is the unimaginable burden on teachers. Research has shown that teachers are the primary individuals who socialize children outside the home. As a result, teachers struggle to mediate which values and heritage to emphasize in the classroom. Furthermore, teachers and school administrators play the interdiscursive role between the public and the government. They alone must navigate standardized curricula requirements with daily needs of dozens of children. In summary, I am proposing that self-determination as an educational model and intertextuality as a means to define unique group identities will mend our broken education system. I hope my argument encourages communities to examine their goals for educating their children in the 21st century. When our children gain intrinsic motivation from their family and community, all Americans of future generations will benefit. As a last disclaimer, mine is a suggestion filled with opportunities for critiques. I also hope educators, politicians, and communities will get angry, excited, and just basically take action for intentional, multicultural, and motivated education. Thank you for your time.